Millionaire humiliates his private driver, but what he didn't know was that the driver was his son abandoned as a child. It all started in New York. At 28, Luke worked as an executive driver for only 3 months. The salary was good, but the treatment wasn't always, especially when it came to Richard Faulkner, the transport company's most important client and, coincidentally, the most difficult one. Richard Faulkner, 56, was one of the wealthiest men in America. The real estate empire he built over 3 decades was equally admired and feared. His signature on a contract could transform entire neighborhoods, erect skyscrapers where communities once stood, or take down competitors as easily as one knocks down a house of cards. At precisely 7 p.m., the revolving doors of the building opened. Richard emerged, his Italian suit impeccably fitted to his still athletic body for his age. Without looking sideways, he walked toward the car as if the entire sidewalk belonged to him. Luke quickly got out, opening the rear door. "Good evening, Mr. Faulkner." Richard didn't respond. He entered the vehicle, his cell phone already glued to his ear, discussing the details of a billion-dollar negotiation as if it were routine. Luke closed the door and took his place behind the wheel, trying to ignore the way Richard spoke, as if the world were merely a board and people were mere pieces to be moved according to his will. The rain began to fall as they entered Fifth Avenue. The traffic, dense even at that hour, became even slower with the downpour. Luke remained alert, navigating between lanes with the skill of someone who was born in New York and knew its arteries, like the lines of his own hand. In the back seat, Richard finally ended the call. The silence that followed was almost palpable, cut only by the sound of rain against metal and glass. At a traffic light, Luke braked smoothly. When the light changed to green, there was a brief moment of hesitation. A car cut in front of him, forcing him to wait a few more seconds before resuming movement. It was enough to awaken Richard's impatience. "Don't you know how to drive?" Luke remained silent, and then after a while Richard became irritated and continued saying, "Didn't your parents teach you manners?" Luke felt the phrase like a punch to the stomach. Raised only by his mother, Sarah, in a modest apartment in Queens, he grew up without knowing his father. Whenever he asked, his mother would look away, saying only that some stories are better left in the past. He swallowed hard and kept calm as he always did when faced with provocations. "I'm sorry, sir." Richard merely rolled his eyes and laughed with disdain. "If you continue like this, you'll spend your entire life serving important people." Anger rose in Luke's throat like bile, but he only gripped the steering wheel tighter. It wasn't just the humiliation. There was something in that voice, in that cold look, in that arrogant manner that provoked in him a strange sensation, almost like a distant echo of something familiar. The rest of the journey to Richard's mansion in the Hamptons proceeded in silence. When they arrived, the rain had transformed into a furious storm. Luke parked under the cover of the main entrance and quickly got out to open the umbrella. But Richard had already left the vehicle, walking hurriedly inside without even a nod goodbye. A uniformed maid waited at the door with a towel. Luke recognized Nancy, the housekeeper who had worked for the Faulkners for more than 2 decades. She gave Luke an understanding look before closing the door. While driving back home, Luke couldn't get the unpleasant encounter out of his head. There was something about the businessman that intrigued and irritated him at the same time. It was as if behind that disdain, there was an incomplete story. Arriving at his apartment in Queens, Luke found his mother watching the 9 o'clock drama. At 48, Sarah Taylor still maintained the beauty that once caught the attention of many men. Her eyes, identical to her son's, carried a permanent melancholy, like someone who keeps a secret too heavy to share. "How is work today, son?" she asked, lowering the volume of the television. Luke hesitated. His mother always worried too much about him. Normal. Nothing special. But Sarah knew him too well. "Something happened. It's written all over your face." Luke sighed, sitting next to her on the worn sofa. "Just a difficult client, a guy named Richard Faulkner. Know him?" The effect of the name was immediate. Sarah turned pale as if she had seen a ghost. The remote control slipped from her hand, falling with a dull thud on the carpet. "Mom? What's wrong?" She tried to disguise it, quickly composing herself. Nothing. Son, I just remembered I left a pot on the stove. She got up hastily and went to the kitchen. Luke followed her, intrigued by that disproportionate reaction. There's nothing on the stove, Mom. What's going on? Do you know this man? Sarah avoided his gaze, nervously fiddling with the empty pots. Don't be silly, how would I know such an important man? But her hands were shaking, and Luke knew that evasive look. It was the same one she had when he asked about his father. That night, after his mother went to bed, Luke couldn't get that strange reaction out of his head. Sitting in the small living room, with only the light from the lamp illuminating the environment, he opened his laptop and typed Richard Faulkner's name in the search engine. Dozens of pages instantly appeared. News about his billion-dollar ventures, interviews in business magazines, photos at gala events alongside politicians and celebrities. Luke navigated through that sea of information, trying to understand what could connect that magnate to his mother. That's when he found an old report dated almost 30 years ago. "Promising young man revolutionizes New York real estate market," said the headline. The photo showed a much younger Richard, around 28, next to a beautiful woman at a cocktail party. Luke brought his face closer to the screen, incredulous. The woman was his mother. The shock was instantaneous. The photo caption identified Richard Faulkner and his girlfriend Sarah Taylor at the inauguration of the first Faulkner Incorporated development. Luke's world seemed to collapse. His mother not only knew Richard Faulkner, she had been his girlfriend. Questions flooded his mind. Like an avalanche, why had she never mentioned this? What had happened between them? And the question that made his heart race, could Richard Faulkner be... No, it would be too much of a coincidence. It would be too cruel. He continued browsing, increasingly frantic. On another page, he found an interview where Richard mentioned that he left behind a turbulent past to focus exclusively on his career. The date of the interview approximately coincided with the period of his conception. Luke felt the blood freeze in his veins. He got up abruptly and went to his mother's, a room. He stopped in front of the closed door, his hand suspended in the air, ready to knock, but he couldn't. What would he say? How would he accuse his mother of having hidden something so important from him his entire life? He returned to the living room, his head boiling. He needed more information before confronting her. He continued his online search until the early hours of the morning when fatigue finally overcame him. The next day, Luke woke up with his body aching from having slept on the sofa. His mother had already left for work at the clothing store, where she had been a manager for more than a decade. On the kitchen table, a note written in her delicate handwriting, "We need to talk when you get back. Love you." Luke's stomach knotted. She knew he had discovered something. During his work shift, Luke transported 3 different executives, but his mind was elsewhere. In every free moment, he thought about the connections, the dates, the coincidences that seemed less and less like coincidences. In the late afternoon, he received a message from his supervisor. He would be Richard Faulkner's driver again, to take him to a business dinner in Manhattan. On the way to the Faulkner Enterprises building, Luke was breathing with difficulty. Each red light was torture. Each advance of the clock hand brought him closer to an encounter that could change his life forever. When he parked in front of the building, he saw that it wasn't just Richard waiting on the sidewalk. Next to him was a tall young man with an arrogant expression and a suit as impeccable as the older man's. Luke immediately recognized him from the photos he had seen online. Mark Faulkner, 30, only son and heir to the Faulkner empire, the legitimate son, the recognized son. Richard and Mark entered the car, talking about the meeting they would have. They barely noticed Luke's presence, as if he were just an extension of the vehicle. "I got all the documents for the Green River project transaction," said Mark with evident pride. "The investors are eager to close the deal tonight." Richard nodded, but his expression remained impassive. "Good work, but don't get too excited. I've seen many deals fall apart at the last minute." The comment seemed to hurt Mark's ego, who straightened his posture, visibly trying to prove his worth. "Dad, I guarantee it will be different this time. I'm controlling every detail." Richard observed his son for a moment, a shadow of disappointment crossing his gaze. "You always say that, Mark, but empty guarantees don't build empires." The rest of the journey proceeded in tense silence. Luke, through the rearview mirror, observed the dynamics between father and son with painful curiosity. Is that what it would be like to have Richard as a father? That incessant pressure, that calculated coldness? At the restaurant, one of the most exclusive in New York, Luke opened the door for the two men. "We'll be back at 11 p.m., Richard informed dryly, without looking directly at him. "Yes, sir." Luke stayed in the car, parked in the permitted area, while the Faulkners dined with their investors. The hours dragged on. He checked his cell phone. 3 missed calls from his mother. He couldn't talk to her now, not before being sure. It was then that he made an impulsive decision. He got out of the car and walked to the entrance of the restaurant. He spoke briefly with the maître d', showing the emblem of the executive transport company. "I need to deliver an urgent message to Mr. Faulkner. Security matter." His credential and confident tone were enough. The maître d' discreetly led him through the luxurious hall to the table where Richard, Mark, and 3 other men in suits were talking animatedly. Red wine glasses reflected the soft lighting, creating small ruby points on the immaculate white tablecloth. Luke approached and leaned next to Richard. "Mr. Faulkner, can I speak with you privately? It's urgent." Richard frowned, irritated by the interruption. "Can't it wait?" "Unfortunately not, sir. It's about security." With a sigh of impatience, Richard excused himself from the guests and followed Luke to a side corridor, away from curious ears. "What's so important?" Luke felt his heart beating so hard that he was sure Richard could hear it. It was now or never. "You knew my mother, Sarah Taylor." The effect was instantaneous. Richard's mask of indifference fell for a second, replaced by pure shock. His eyes, which Luke now realized were identical to his own, widened slightly, before returning to their usual coldness. "I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know any Sarah." But the brief lapse had already confirmed everything. Luke felt the anger grow, decades of absence and lies condensed into a single moment. "Of course you do. You dated almost 30 years ago, before I was born." Richard turned pale but tried to maintain his composure. "Look, kid, I don't know what game this is, but—" "It's not a game," interrupted Luke, taking from his pocket a printed photo he had found online showing Richard and Sarah together. "This is my mother, and I have reasons to believe that you are my father." Time seemed to freeze. Richard stared at the old photo, a mixture of indecipherable emotions crossing his face. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but firm. "Get back to the car now." "But now!" Richard's voice rose dangerously, attracting glances from nearby waiters. "I won't discuss this here. We'll talk later." Luke knew he had crossed a line. With his heart still racing, but feeling a strange sense of triumph, he returned to the car. The first step had been taken. There was no going back. In the restaurant, Richard tried to compose himself, smoothing his suit as if he could erase the marks of the past with the same gesture. Sarah Taylor. A name he hadn't heard in almost 3 decades, a name he tried to forget with all his strength. When he returned to the table, Mark immediately noticed the change in his father's demeanor. "Any problem?" Richard forced a professional smile. "Nothing important." But to Mark, trained from an early age to perceive the nuances of business and people, it was clear that something had shaken his father, and that rarely happened. The dinner continued, contracts were discussed, glasses were toasted, but Richard's mind was elsewhere. In the past. With Sarah. In the absurd but terrifying possibility that that young driver was his son. When they left the restaurant around 11:30 p.m., Mark said goodbye to the investors and got into the car with his father. Luke was already waiting for them, his face a mask of professionalism, as if the confrontation hours earlier had never happened. On the way back, the silence inside the vehicle was oppressive. Mark, irritated by his father's distraction during crucial points of the negotiation, checked messages on his cell phone. Richard looked out the window, lost in thought. Luke, in his turn, kept his eyes fixed on the road, but his mind was buzzing. Upon arriving at the Faulkner mansion, Mark exited first. "I'm going in, Dad. I need to finalize some documents for tomorrow." Richard nodded but made no move to leave the car. When Mark had already entered the house, he finally spoke. "Wait." The word was directed at Luke, who was already preparing to leave. "Come to my office tomorrow at 10 a.m., company address. Tell reception you have a meeting with me. They'll let you up." Without waiting for a response, Richard got out of the car and walked into the house, leaving Luke with a mixture of anxiety and hope. That night, upon returning home, Luke found his mother in the living room, waiting for him. Her gaze mixed, worry and an old sadness. "You found out, didn't you?" she asked as soon as he entered. Luke nodded, sitting next to her. "Why did you never tell me, Mum?" Sarah sighed, her hands clasped on her lap as if holding an invisible burden. "It wasn't out of malice, son. I wanted to protect you." "Protect me from what?" "From knowing who my father is." She raised her eyes, tearful but determined. "Richard and it was intense but brief. He was starting his career, determined to become an important name. When I discovered I was pregnant, he was already involved with the daughter of a major investor, a relationship more appropriate for his ambitions, according to him." Luke felt his throat tighten. "Did you tell him about me?" "I tried, but I couldn't. Before I could talk to Richard, I received a visit from a man, the father of his new girlfriend, William Harrison. He offered me money to disappear, to never look for Richard again. He said that his son-in-law project had a bright future ahead, and that I and an unwanted child would just be an obstacle." Luke felt his anger grow. "And you accepted?" Sarah shook her head, a solitary tear rolling down her face. "Not for the money, Luke. I refused. But then William changed tactics. He said that if I told Richard about the pregnancy, he would ensure that no door would open for me in New York, that he would use his influence to destroy me professionally. I was alone, pregnant, scared. So you ran away. I moved to the countryside, to my aunt's house in Connecticut. That's where you were born. We only returned to New York when you were 5, when I learned that William had suffered a stroke and was no longer a threat. But by then, Richard was already married to William's daughter, Claire. They already had a son, Mark. He had moved on. What right did I have to reappear and destroy the life he had built?" Luke stood up, unable to contain his agitation. "What right? Mom, he's my father. I had the right to know, to meet him. And what do you think would have happened, Luke? Do you think Richard would have left everything to be the father of a son he didn't even know existed? He was already on the path to becoming the man he is today. Powerful, ruthless. You don't know what would have happened." Sarah looked at her son with a mixture of love and sadness. "No, I don't know. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe I should have fought harder, but I did what I thought was best for both of us at the time." Luke sat down again, his initial anger giving way to painful confusion. "I confronted him today, showed him a photo of you two, said I believe he's my father." Sarah's eyes widened in shock. "What? Luke, that's crazy. He's a dangerous man. He wants to meet me tomorrow at his office. Don't go." Sarah's voice was filled with panic. "You don't know Richard like I knew him. He may seem sophisticated and controlled, but inside, he will do anything to protect what he's built." Luke took his mother's hands in his. "I need to go, Mom. I need to look him in the eye and hear the truth. I need to know why he never looked for me, even after you returned to New York." "He didn't know, Luke. I'm sure William never told him. And afterwards, well, New York is a huge city. Our paths never crossed, or at least I thought they hadn't. Until I became his driver," Luke completed, seeing destiny weave its complex web before them. "Why now, after so many years?" Sarah shook her head, as perplexed as he was. "I don't know, son. Maybe it's time for the truth to come out." That night, neither of them could sleep. Each in their room, mother and son faced the ghosts of the past and the uncertainty of the future. The next morning, Luke wore his best clothes, dark dress pants and a light blue shirt that his mother had given him on his last birthday. It wasn't nearly as elegant as Richard's Italian suits, but it was the best he had. "Be careful," said Sarah, adjusting her son's collar with trembling hands. Whatever truth you find today, remember, you are my son, and nothing will change that." Luke nodded, hugging her before leaving. The Faulkner Enterprises building seemed even more imposing in daylight, a monolith of glass and steel that rose 40 floors above the ground, dominating the urban landscape. In the luxurious reception, Luke informed his name to the receptionist. "I have a meeting with Mr. Richard Faulkner. He's expecting me." The woman checked the system, clearly surprised but maintained her professionalism. "Yes, Mr. Taylor, please go to the 40th floor. Mr. Faulkner's assistant will receive you there." In the panoramic elevator, Luke felt his stomach turn, and it wasn't just because of the height. Every meter he rose brought him closer to a confrontation 3 decades delayed. On the top floor, the doors opened to a stunning executive floor. Glass walls offered a 360-degree view of the city. A woman in her 40s, elegantly dressed, waited for him. "Mr. Taylor, I'm Regina, Mr. Faulkner's assistant. Please follow me." She led him down a corridor with several meeting rooms until they reached an imposing dark wood door. She knocked softly, and after a command from inside, opened it. "Mr. Faulkner, Mr. Taylor has arrived." Luke entered an office that seemed out of a movie, spacious, decorated with massive wooden furniture and contemporary artwork. Behind an imposing desk was Richard, looking at the city through the panoramic window. He turned slowly. "Thank you, Regina. I don't want to be interrupted for the next hour." The assistant nodded and left, closing the door. Richard indicated a chair in front of the desk. "Sit down." Luke obeyed, his heart hammering against his chest. For a few moments neither spoke. It was as if they were evaluating each other, looking for similarities, differences, any sign of connection. "Is your mother well?" Richard finally asked, his voice controlled. The question caught Luke by surprise. "Yes, she knew that we met." Richard nodded, as if he already expected that. "Sarah was always an intelligent woman." He paused, looking directly into Luke's eyes. "I want to do a DNA test." Luke straightened in the chair. "So you believe it might be true?" "I don't believe anything without concrete evidence. That's how I built my empire." Richard took a card from the desk and handed it to Luke. "This is the contact of a discreet laboratory. They're expecting us this afternoon." It wasn't quite what Luke expected. He imagined screams, denials, maybe even threats. Not this clinical efficiency, this pragmatic approach. "And if the result is positive, what happens then?" Richard drummed his fingers on the desk thoughtfully. "We'll deal with that when we're certain. I don't make decisions based on what ifs." Something in the cold response rekindled Luke's anger. "I'm not a decision to be made. I'm a person, possibly your son." Richard stared at him for a long moment, his face an impenetrable mask. "You don't understand the world I live in. Luke, nothing is simple, ever. Maybe because you complicate everything." The comment provoked something resembling a smile on Richard's usually impassive face. "You have your mother's spirit." It was the first indication that Richard really remembered Sarah, that she had meant something in his life. Luke felt a strange wave of emotion. "She always fought for me, alone." Richard looked away, and for the first time, Luke saw what appeared to be genuine regret. "I never knew she was pregnant." "That's what she told me." "But didn't you ever try to find her?" "After she disappeared?" Richard rose, walking to the window. Against the light, his silhouette seemed more human, less the imposing figure who commanded an empire. "At first, yes. But she vanished completely. No one knew where she had gone. Then, life went on. I married Claire. Mark was born. The company grew exponentially. Time passes, and you forgot. I never forgot." The response was quick, almost automatic, surprising them both. Richard turned, regaining his composure. "Life sometimes forces us to make difficult choices, Luke. We're not always the hero of the story." Before Luke could respond, the office door opened abruptly. Mark entered, his face contorted in a mixture of distrust and arrogance. "Dad, Regina told me you were in a meeting with—" He stopped upon seeing Luke, immediately recognizing him. "The driver? What the hell is he doing here?" Richard seemed irritated by the interruption. "Mark, I'm in a private meeting." But Mark didn't back down. He approached the desk, analyzing Luke as if he were an anomaly. "What kind of private meeting do you have with a driver?" "It's none of your business," replied Richard, with a coldness that would make anyone retreat. Anyone except Mark. Raised to be as ruthless as his father, he wasn't easily intimidated. "It is my business if it involves the company. Our investors are waiting for the contracts you should have reviewed yesterday, but you're here talking to him." The disdain in Mark's voice was palpable. Luke stood up, feeling that his presence was only complicating an already tense situation. "Maybe I should come back another day." "No," Richard's voice was firm. "Mark, leave, now." But Mark continued, staring at Luke, a growing suspicion in his eyes. "Wait a minute." He moved closer, studying Luke's face. "There's something strange here. You two—" A heavy silence fell over the room. Mark looked from his father to Luke and back to his father, connecting invisible dots. "Don't tell me he's another one of your lost children out there." The accusation hit Luke like a slap. Another one. Were there others? Richard took a threatening step towards his son. "Enough, Mark! Out now!" "Another one?" repeated Luke, unable to contain the question. "What does that mean?" Mark smiled, a joyless smile, laden with bitterness. "Oh, he didn't tell you. Daddy has a collection of mistakes along the way. Only all the others were bought off before they were even born. How much did he offer you to disappear? Didn't accept the first offer. Smart." "Mark!" Richard's voice thundered through the office. "Out!" But the damage was already done. Luke looked at Richard with new eyes, as if seeing through the facade of a respectable man for the first time. "Is it true? Are there others?" Richard rubbed his face with his hands, a surprisingly vulnerable gesture for someone so controlled. "There are no others. There were extortion attempts in the past, people claiming to be mothers of my children. I always resolved discreetly with financial agreements. They were never confirmed." "Financial agreements," repeated Luke, his voice laden with contempt. "Is that how you solve your problems? With money?" Mark let out a bitter laugh. "Welcome to the family, driver, if you really belong to it." The tension in the room was palpable. 3 men connected by blood and secrets, each fighting with his own demons. "I don't want your money," Luke finally said, looking directly at Richard. "I don't want your name or your company. I just want the truth." The statement seemed to surprise both Richard and Mark. Neither was accustomed to someone who didn't want something material from them. At that moment, the door opened. Again. Regina entered, her face concerned. "Mr. Faulkner, sorry to interrupt, but it's urgent. The Green River Project investors just called. There seems to be a discrepancy in the documents. They're threatening to withdraw support if it's not clarified immediately." Richard looked at Mark, who turned pale. "What kind of discrepancy?" Regina hesitated, looking at Luke. "Sir, perhaps it's better if we discuss this privately." But Richard, already irritated with the interruptions, made an impatient gesture. "Just say it, Regina. The numbers in the financial documents don't match the agreed values. There's a difference of almost 30 million. The investors are suggesting that, well, that there was deliberate manipulation." Richard's eyes slowly turned to Mark, who now seemed about to collapse. "Mark, did you review these documents before sending them?" Mark swallowed hard. "Yes, but it must be a typing error. Nothing serious." 30 million isn't a typing error, Mark." Richard rarely raised his voice, but now it echoed off the walls of the office. This could bring down the entire project. Years of work thrown away. Regina, sensing the gravity of the situation, discreetly retreated. "I'll say you'll return the call in 5 minutes." When the door closed, Richard turned back to Mark, the anger palpable. "What did you do?" Mark, cornered, ran his hand through his hair nervously. "Nothing, it was a mistake. Everyone makes mistakes. This isn't a common mistake, and you know it." Richard approached his son, his eyes flashing. "Tell the truth. What were you trying to do?" Luke, feeling like an intruder in a family crisis, silently headed for the door. But before he could leave, Mark exploded. You never trust me, always thinking I'm going to mess everything up. Well, maybe I tried to improve the deal, increase our margin. What's wrong with that? Richard seemed unable to believe what he was hearing. Improve the deal? By falsifying documents? That's a crime, Mark. Crime is what you did to get where you are, retorted Mark, years of resentment overflowing at once. You think I don't know about your maneuvers in the past, the people you destroyed, and now you're playing the righteous man for this driver who appeared out of nowhere? Luke froze with his hand on the doorknob. The conversation had taken a dangerous turn, revealing layers of tension between father and son that he had never imagined. Richard seemed to have aged 10 years in a minute. Get out, Mark. Fix this mess. Now. Mark looked at his father with bitterness, then shot a venomous look at Luke. This isn't over. It wasn't clear who the threat was directed at. When Mark left, slamming the door, a heavy silence fell over the room. Richard returned to his chair, looking exhausted. You should go too, Luke. I have a crisis to manage. But Luke didn't move. Is it true what he said? About you building your empire and by destroying people? Richard looked at him with a mixture of weariness and resignation. The business world isn't for the weak, Luke. Sometimes difficult decisions need to be made. People get hurt in the process. He paused, looking at a framed photo of Mark as a child on the desk. But I never imagined that my own son... He didn't complete the sentence, shaking his head. Luke felt a strange mixture of emotions. Part of him wanted to console the broken man before him. Another part wondered if he had been blessed by not growing up under the shadow of Richard Faulkner. Still want to do the test? He asked, surprising himself. Richard looked up, equally surprised by the question. More than ever. 3 days later, Luke and Richard met again, this time at a discreet cafe in Brooklyn. The DNA test result had arrived in record time, thanks to Richard's influence. Neither had opened the envelope. By some tacit agreement, they decided they should be together when they learned the truth. Richard arrived first, choosing a table in the back, away from curious eyes. When Luke entered, he was already on his second cup of coffee. You came, said Richard, with something that seemed like relief in his voice. Luke nodded, sitting down. Did you bring it? Richard placed a brown envelope on the table. For a moment, neither made any move to pick it up. You look well, commented Richard, studying Luke's face, considering everything. And you look tired. Richard let out something close to a laugh. 3 days of crisis tend to do that to a person. He took a sip of coffee. We managed to save the project. Mark is temporarily removed. The board decided he needs time to mature. I'm sorry. And Luke really was sorry. Despite everything, it was evident that Richard loved his son in his own twisted and complicated way. Don't be. Maybe it's the best thing for him, for all of us. Richard looked at the envelope. Ready? Luke took a deep breath. Ready? Richard opened the envelope with methodical care. He pulled out 3 sheets of paper, read quickly, and then, without a word, passed them to Luke. The words danced before Luke's eyes, technical terms and percentages, until he reached the conclusion, the probability of paternity is 99.9998%. Even though he already suspected, seeing the confirmation in black and white was impactful. Luke felt the world spin slightly. For 28 years, he had wondered about his father. Now, the man was sitting across from him, watching him with an indescribable expression. Well, Richard finally said, his voice controlled, that clarifies the matter. Luke raised his eyes from the paper. That's it? That clarifies the matter? What do you want me to say, Luke? That I'm sorry I wasn't there, that I regret never knowing of your existence until now. There was a raw sincerity in Richard's voice that Luke had never heard before. I can't change the past. I can't recover the lost years. I'm not asking to change the past. Luke carefully folded the paper, returning it to Richard. I just wanted to understand, and now I do. You do? Richard seemed genuinely curious. I understand that even if you had known about me, maybe nothing would have been different. You had your ambitions, your plans. There was no room for a child from a passing relationship. The words were harsh, but there was no accusation in Luke's voice, just observation. Richard studied the bottom of his cup for a long moment. You're partially right. I was ambitious, obsessed with success. But you're wrong on another point. Your relationship with your mother wasn't fleeting for me. He raised his eyes, facing Luke. Sarah was special. Different from anyone I met before or after. She saw through my masks, challenged my certainties. She was the only person who loved me for who I was, not for what I could become. Luke hadn't expected this. The image of the cold and calculating father was fragmenting before his eyes. Then why did you leave her? Because I was young and stupid. Richard laughed without humor. William, Claire's father, offered what I wanted most, a quick path to success. The price was marrying his daughter. At the time, it seemed like a fair trade. He paused, his gaze distant. I only realized what I had lost much later when it was too late. And my mother? What happened to her? Richard sighed. William told me she had broken up with me, that she had found someone better. I believed it because it was easier than admitting that I had hurt her. Years later, when I met a mutual friend again, I learned that she had disappeared. No one knew where to. I tried to look for her, but there were no traces. Gradually, the pieces of the puzzle fit together. William's manipulation, Sarah's forced silence, the strategic disappearance. A web of lies that kept father and son apart for almost 3 decades. And now? Luke finally asked. What happens now? Richard looked at the young man before him, his son, his blood. There was so much of Sarah in him, the determination in his eyes, the integrity that shone through in every word. But there were also traces of himself, the posture, the chin, the way he furrowed his brow when thinking. Now, it's up to you to decide, Luke. I can offer formal recognition, financial support, a place in the company, or I can simply leave your life, if that's what you prefer. Luke shook his head, a sad smile on his lips. You still don't understand, do you? I don't want any of that. I don't want your money or your company. I just wanted to know who I am, where I come from, and now I know. So, that's it? A civilized ending, and each goes his own way. There was something in Richard's voice, disappointment perhaps, that surprised Luke. I didn't say that. I said I don't want material things from you, but maybe we can get to know each other as people, not as boss and employee, not as rich father and abandoned son, just 2 men trying to understand each other. Richard seemed to consider the proposal for a long moment. Then he extended his hand across the table. I think I can do that. Luke accepted the handshake. It wasn't an emotional reunion hug like in the movies. It was a cautious beginning, a first step on an uncertain path. Are you going to tell Mark? Luke asked, suddenly remembering his half-brother. Richard's countenance darkened. Eventually, yes, but now is not the time. He's fragile. Luke nodded, understanding. Mark would have to deal with his own battles before accepting a new member in the family. And my mother? Do you want to see her? The question caught Richard by surprise. His face registered a cascade of emotions, hesitation, fear, hope. Would she accept seeing me? There's only one way to find out. In the modest apartment in Queens, Sarah Taylor was finishing tidying up the living room. She had spent the morning cleaning, organizing, putting fresh flowers in the vase on the center table, a nervous ritual to occupy her hands and mind while waiting for Luke's arrival. Luke and the man he would bring with him. The doorbell rang exactly at 4 p.m. Sarah took a deep breath, adjusted her simple but elegant dress, and walked to the door. Luke entered first, his eyes seeking his mother's, silently reassuring her. Then Richard entered. 30 years had passed since the last time they saw each other. The ambitious young man was now a mature man, with grey strands at his temples, and expression lines that told stories of success and loneliness. But the eyes were the same that once made her believe in promises of eternal love. Hello, Sarah, he said, his voice softer than Luke had ever heard. Richard, she smiled, a smile that mixed decades of stored emotions. You look well. You're beautiful, as always." Luke discreetly retreated, feeling that this moment belonged only to the two of them. Decades of misunderstandings, of lies and external manipulations had kept those two souls apart. Now they had the chance to look at each other without interference, without pressure, without the weight of others' expectations. The conversation began hesitantly, interspersed with silences loaded with meaning. Gradually, layers of defense fell away. Timid laughs emerged, shared memories resurfaced. Luke observed, amazed, how two people could keep so much of each other for so long, how the past never really dies, just sleeps, waiting for the right moment to awaken. At one point, Richard took Sarah's hands in his. "I never knew, Sarah. I swear by everything that's sacred. If I had known—" She gently placed a finger on his lips. "The past is gone, Richard. We can't change it. We can only decide what to do with the present." The three talked until nightfall, building bridges over the abyss of lost years. There were no resentments, just the mature understanding that all had been, to some extent, victims of circumstances and others' choices. When Richard finally said goodbye, promising to return, there was a light in his eyes that Luke had never seen before. A light that spoke of possibilities, of new beginnings, of hope. "Will he really come back?" Luke asked his mother, after Richard left. Sarah smiled, looking at the closed door. "Some stories don't end, son, they just take a pause." In the weeks that followed, an unusual routine was established. Luke continued working as a driver, though now for other clients. On Sundays, he, Sarah, and Richard met for lunches that extended into the late afternoon, gradually filling the void of years of absence. Mark, contrary to what many expected, didn't react with fury to the news of a half-brother. The scandal with the investors had been a turning point for him. Removed from the company, seeking treatment for problems he had long denied having, he found in Luke not a rival, but a mirror, someone who, like him, was seeking his place in the world. Their first meeting was tense, laden with expectations and prejudices. But when Luke extended his hand, offering not judgment but understanding, something changed in Mark's eyes. "Why don't you hate me?" he asked, confused. "I tried to push you away, said horrible things." Luke shrugged. "Because we don't choose the family we're born into, but we can choose the kind of family we want to be." Richard observed the interaction between his two sons with a mixture of pride and shame. Pride for the maturity they showed, shame for not having been the one to teach it. Over the months, a gradual transformation occurred, not just in personal relationships, but in the very structure of Faulkner Enterprises. The empire that Richard had built with relentless ambition began to adopt new values. Social housing projects were developed in areas previously destined for luxury developments. Environmental responsibility became a priority, not just a marketing item. And most surprising to everyone, Richard announced his intention to gradually step away from the presidency. "I want to recover lost time," he explained to Luke in one of their frequent meetings. "I built an empire, but lost what really mattered along the way." When Mark returned to the company, after months of reflection and treatment, it wasn't to the position of president that everyone expected. Instead, he took leadership of the newly created Faulkner Foundation, dedicated to social and educational projects in underprivileged communities. And Luke, he continued his life as always, working, studying, taking care of his mother. He repeatedly refused Richard's offers to join the company or accept financial support. "I don't need your money." "Dad," he would say, the word dad still sounding strange but increasingly natural. "I just need you to be present." And Richard was, not as the feared business magnate, but as a man rediscovering the value of family, of honesty, of unconditional love. On an autumn afternoon, almost a year after that fateful rainy drive, the four gathered for lunch at Richard's house. Sarah, after months of hesitation, had finally agreed to visit him at his Hamptons mansion. In the spacious garden under the shade of a century-old tree, Richard raised a glass. "To family, not the one destiny gives us, but the one we build by choice every day." Luke, Mark, and Sarah raised their glasses, joining the toast. In that moment, as the New York sun bathed the garden in a golden light, Luke understood that the true empire wasn't made of concrete and glass. It was of human bonds, of forgiveness, of new beginnings. An empire that no fortune could buy, but that any willing heart could build. End of the story. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Luke and Richard has touched your hearts. If you enjoyed this narrative about second chances and new beginnings, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave a like on the video. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the complexity of human relationships and the unexpected paths of destiny. Share in the comments. Do you believe it's possible to rebuild family bonds after so much time? We eagerly await your opinions and don't miss our upcoming content.